Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Welcome, everybody, to this Peak Prosperity Podcast. I am your host, Chris Martenson, and it is April 2nd, 2018. Now, out of the 8 forms of capital that are essential to leading a full and happy life today, as well as being resilient during a possibly turbulent future, is emotional capital. Staying alert and happy and fulfilled is especially difficult when your larger cultural narrative is being revealed as unworkable or possibly even fraudulent. In the United States, where everything from cat food to fear is professionally marketed to, or maybe I should say at us, we discover one of the highest rates in the world of prescription drug use, especially for the psychiatric and anti-anxiety drug classes. The statistics are gripping. 1 in 6 Americans takes a psychiatric drug. Over 130,000 U.S. toddlers, children between 0 and 5 years of age, are prescribed addictive anti-anxiety drugs, including the wildly addictive and difficult to stop using benzodiazepines. Disturbingly, a very high proportion of the school shootings in the U.S. were committed by young men on such drugs. The benefits of these drugs are marketed to us daily, but what about the downsides? What about the side effects? More importantly, do they even work? What's the data tell us? To discuss this with us today is Robert Whitaker, an American journalist and author who has won numerous awards as a journalist covering medicine and science. In 1998, he co-wrote a series on psychiatric research for the Boston Globe that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for public service. His first book, Mad in America, was named by Discover magazine as one of the best science books of 2002, and his book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, won the 2010 Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. He is the publisher of madinamerica.com. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you've spent a long time now investigating the use of psychiatric drugs and now run a website and an organization called Mad in America. Tell us, Robert, how did you get involved in this story and how it ultimately became your mission?
You know, I got involved in a very backdoor way. I actually had very little interest in psychiatry. I'd been a medical reporter for newspapers for a long time, and I actually did a piece of time at Harvard Medical School as the director of publications. Anyway, I had done this series, co-wrote the series on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I had a completely conventional understanding of modern psychiatry. My understanding was we were discovering the biological causes of depression and schizophrenia, that they were due to chemical imbalances, and that we had these drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. And that's an incredible story of progress. But while I was doing that series, I came upon some research that belied that story of progress. One, it was studies done by the World Health Organization that twice found that outcomes for schizophrenia patients were much better in the poor countries of the world, specifically India and Nigeria, than in the U.S. That was surprising to me. Two, in those studies, the best outcomes were in countries where they used antipsychotics acutely for a short period of time, but not chronically, not as maintenance drugs, which went completely against what the standard of care here is in the United States. And then I also came upon a study by Harvard Medical School researchers that said that outcomes for schizophrenia patients, rather than having improved over the last 20 years, had actually deteriorated, and they were now no better than in the first third of the 20th century. So all this belied that story of progress, and that put me on this long journey of trying to find out what's going on here. We have one public story, but what does science really tell us about, do these drugs fix chemical imbalances? Are they improving outcomes? And really, in some ways, I've spent the last 20 years, in one manner or another, writing about the huge gap between what the public is told and what the science actually shows about what we know about mental disorders and the effectiveness of psychiatric drugs.
Now, Robert, it's a fascinating arc because my own story follows a similar arc. I came across some data that I thought I was just going to tell once, and it took on a life of its own, because once you really get in there and you are involved with the data, and it begins to tell you something that's completely different from the dominant narrative, I understand how it can become really compelling to want to do something with that and let people know, because these are really important things. It affects people's lives, livelihoods, total outcomes. And I noted that from your website, MAD in America opens its mission statement with this, quote, "MAD in America's mission is to serve as a catalyst for rethinking psychiatric care in the United States and abroad. We believe that the current drug-based paradigm of care has failed our society, and that scientific research, as well as the lived experience of those who have been diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, calls for profound change." Now, I want to hold that mission front and center while we work through this data in this podcast. You touched on this a bit, Robert. Let's begin to build the case for this need for profound change. And I want to start here. How much do we actually know about the biology of mental disorders?
That's a great first question, and it can be answered very quickly. Virtually nothing.
Oh, okay. Next.
There are some psychiatric symptoms are secondary to physical illnesses, right? Parkinson's, for example, often leads to psychotic symptoms. And there's infections that can, inflammatory problems, viral disorders. But what happens is once you identify those, illnesses that can produce secondary symptoms, they fall out of the realm of psychiatry, and then you get a diagnosis of Parkinson's or whatever it might be. So within the field of what we call, depression or schizophrenia, anxiety, ADHD, it's just a mystery. The biology of these disorders remains unknown. And undoubtedly, there's many, many, many pathways to, these symptoms. And that's the part of the first sort of big betrayal of the American public, is that we were told that the biological causes had been discovered. They were due to chemical imbalances, and that we had drugs that can fix them. But you actually find, when you research that story, it was a hypothesis born in the 1960s based on an understanding of how antidepressants and antipsychotics acted on the brain. And then researchers hypothesized that maybe the disorder was due to the opposite problem. So, for example, if antidepressants up serotonergic activity, they hypothesized that people with depression had too little serotonin activity. But here's the amazing part of that. Then they had to investigate, do people with depression in fact have low serotonin before they go on these medications, antidepressants? And as early as 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health said, when we do studies in depressed patients who haven't been on these meds, we're just not finding a problem with the serotonergic system. And then there was a lot of more research. And in 1999, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said this: we're just not finding any evidence that people with depression have low serotonin. And then they sort of made fun of the whole hypothesis. They said there's no reason that, quote, the pathology of a disorder should be the opposite of the mechanism of action of a drug. So that's what the science was saying. That's what, in fact, psychiatry was reading in their own textbook. And yet, at the same time, you can find that the American Psychiatric Association is putting out public materials saying we now know that depression is due to low serotonin, and that we have drugs that can fix them. And they said this in magazines. They said this they put out press releases to that effect. Once they had their website up, they put that on their website. And that's what I mean between this gap between what the science shows and what the public is told. And just think what a betrayal that is to the public.
Robert, this reminds me of medical science does go off the rails from time to time, and perhaps most alarmingly in areas where they go simplistic and it's actually a complex system. And I'm thinking now of it's the early 90s. They said, wow, people are getting fat. Let's cut fat out of the diet. That must be it, right? If people are getting fat, it must be they're eating fat. And it turned out that the advice that came forward has resulted in one of the largest obesity epidemics ever seen, and it really is, and now we understand, it's about insulin and it's calories, and there's this whole other complex system. Actually, it's carbohydrates, much more complex than we thought, but it took decades to begin to unravel that first insult, which was a bad connection. It was a poor hypothesis, and it got ran with. So
yeah.
Does that sound like a similar story here?
Absolutely. And there's two parts to this. The human body is so so complex. So bodily functions are complex. In other words, how we take calories in and how our bodies are, metabolize it and how we, convert that into energy. And then there's nothing more complex than the brain, right?
Right.
How consciousness arises. The sort of arrogance and the hubris that you could figure out which molecule caused depression in the brain and fix it. There's so much arrogance and hubris. And I think it's similar to what you're talking about with the fat theory about what causes obesity. And then the other thing is amazing. Once you have some sort of medical truth, so to speak, promoted to the public, boy, it is hard to dislodge that idea. And there's still plenty of people around the world that think chemical imbalances, low serotonin is the cause of depression, even though all the researchers now said, yeah, no, we didn't find that. And I don't know about this. I'm not as well versed in diet, but I'm sure there's plenty of people who still think that the fat is the problem that leads to an obesity epidemic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's once those ideas get lodged, but this is crazy here. So the mechanistic process here was they said, well, okay, we have these synaptic clefts, right? So there's an axon and a dendrite, and the neurons are talking to each other, and sometimes they use dopamine as the neurotransmitter, sometimes it's serotonin. So, hey, if we can just muck around with that, maybe we can increase the amount of serotonin or other things just very quickly so people understand the mechanism, because I think it's helpful. What's actually happening with these, the antidepressants at the synaptic level?
I think this is important. It's a little complex. So as you said, the way neurons communicate with each other, you have a presynaptic neuron, which will release a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger like serotonin, into that tiny gap between neurons, which we call the synaptic cleft. And then that molecule, serotonin, will bind with receptors on the receiving neuron, which we call the postsynaptic neuron. And we say that that molecule fits with receptors like a key into a lock. And that's the way messages are passed from neuron 1 to neuron 2. And if you have a messenger like serotonin, it causes that second neuron to fire. Now, in order to have this crisp messaging system, the brain has to have a way to remove that chemical messenger, that serotonin, from the synaptic cleft. And the way it does is two ways. Either it goes up back into the serotonin goes back up into the presynaptic neuron via reuptake channel, and it's stored there later for reuse, or an enzyme comes along, metabolizes the serotonin, and the metabolites are carted off as waste. Now, the primary mechanism of removal is that reuptake mechanism. So what does Prozac do? What do SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, do? They block that reuptake process, okay? That means serotonin stays longer in the synaptic cleft than normal. So theoretically, you're upping serotonergic activity. So once they understood that's how the drugs work, they said, oh, maybe depression is due to too little serotonin. But then they actually had to study it, and they didn't find that to be so. So the first point is antidepressants, and this is true of all psychiatric drugs, interrupt some normal functioning of the brain, this passaging of messages. Now, the second part of this that is so key to this whole question is, well, how does the brain respond to this presence of this drug? And the brain, being this extraordinarily neuroplastic organ with all sorts of feedback loops, immediately begins to say, uh-oh, I've got a problem. Serotonin is staying too long in the synaptic cleft. So now what do I have to do? I have to downregulate. I have to decrease my own serotonergic activity. So what it will do, in order to compensate for the presence of the drug, and in order to maintain what researchers say is a homeostatic equilibrium, meaning normal functioning, the presynaptic neurons will begin to put out less serotonin than normal. Now, that compensatory mechanism may break down after a while. And then on the postsynaptic side, they actually will decrease their density of receptors for serotonin. They're trying to become, we call it down-regulating. So here's the way to think about this. The drug acts as an accelerator, and now your brain puts down the brake on its own serotonergic system, the physiology of that system. So the final irony is this, and this is, I think, almost hard to imagine. Before you go on an antidepressant, you have no known serotonergic deficiency, okay, with that system. But once you go on and you have this drug that perturbs normal activity, it actually drives the brain into the very subserotonergic state hypothesized to cause depression in the first place. And this this problem, it's called oppositional tolerance within research circles. And this problem means that for basically every psychiatric drug, what it ultimately does is drive your brain in the opposite direction of what the drug is trying to do. So for example, antipsychotics block dopamine function. What they do that by blocking the receptors on the postsynaptic neurons, which made researchers hypothesize maybe schizophrenia psychosis is due to too much dopamine. And while they didn't find that as a matter of course in those disorders, once you're on this drug, it'll actually increase the density of your dopamine receptors. So conceptually, here's the thing. We're told these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain. Chemical imbalances in the brain. What science tells us is that we don't know the biology of these disorders. The drugs perturb normal activity. And at the end of the compensatory process, the drugs have induced the very abnormalities hypothesized to cause these disorders in the first place. That's the scientific story.
So they're creating the very thing that they are supposed to be treating.
Yes.
And dialing that up. Now, Robert, I went through an entire slide deck of yours titled Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's simply fantastic. It can be found on your website, Mad in America. I'm going to link to it. And in fact, I'm going to send it to a lot of people I know because it's really very enlightening and also infuriating. I actually got angry when I was going through it because, and maybe I read this wrong, please correct me if I have, where the data that you present, and there's a lot of data in there, it seems to sum up to this: current psychiatric drug treatments actually lead to measurably worse outcomes, especially over the long term. Lots of data seems to say that. Have I been selective and unfair in how I read that data?
No, not at all. I mean, the drugs maybe have efficacy in clinical trials over the short term, meaning they beat placebo in those studies. But the evidence is overwhelming that over the long term, the medications of whatever class of drugs, they increase the risk that a person will become sort of chronically ill, functionally impaired, end up on disability, that sort of thing. And now I know people are going to be saying, "Oh, I love my drugs. They've helped me." When we talk about drugs that worsen outcomes over the long term, we are saying in the aggregate. In other words, you look at the spectrum of outcomes in the medicated group and you compare that to the spectrum of outcomes in the unmedicated group. In every study you can find, the spectrum of outcomes are better in the unmedicated group. And really what this is pointing to is that there is in nature, and you began your program with sort of emotional capital. Mm-hmm. Humans have a resilience within them, and psychiatric disorders so often can be episodic in nature. I mean, that's the natural course, say, for most depressive episodes, and including, by the way, the majority of first episode psychotic episodes, and obviously with anxiety, these sort of things. So one of the reasons you see that the drugs are worsening outcomes in the aggregate is because actually there's such good natural recovery rates. So that's what's lost from this conversation is, what is the capacity of humans to recover from a depressive episode, an anxiety episode, even a psychotic episode without drugs, with other support? This is not like just leave them alone. It's actually quite good. And unfortunately, medicated outcomes are not nearly so good.
And you had a really interesting version of the Hippocratic Oath I hadn't heard in that slide deck, which says, in order for a treatment to do no harm, it must improve on natural recovery rates. And what you're saying now is that the natural recovery rates for things like depressive episodes and things like that are actually made worse, measurably worse when people are on long-term psychiatric drug use. Is there any other way to read the data at this point?
No, unfortunately, no. And let's talk about depression. First of all, I think that's really important. What about the Hippocratic Oath? Because we often think the Hippocratic Oath is, do no harm, don't make my patients worse, right? Mm-hmm. It's not what it means. What Hippocrates was really saying was there is a natural capacity to recover. Yep. And in order for your treatment to not do harm on the whole, you have to improve on those natural recovery rates. So, for example, imagine you're a doctor, and whatever the illness is, people come in, you cure half the patients, and the other half stay the same. No one gets worse, right? Mm-hmm. You're the doctor saying, like, I have a pretty effective therapy. And Hippocrates would say, well, you don't know. because what's the natural recovery rate, natural cure rate? And so if the natural cure rate, let's say, is 75% and 25% stay the same, what you've done with your therapy is knock down the recovery rate from 75 to 50%. So you've worsened overall outcomes. And that's what you see with the psychiatric drugs. So, for example, the NIMH did a study about what is the 1-year recovery rate for untreated depression. And they've done several of these studies. And anywhere, it's as high as 85%, which, by the way, is even what you used to see in old hospitalized patients before the antidepressants. And as early as 1970, researchers were saying, boy, it's going to be hard to beat that natural recovery rate. All we can really hope to do is speed up recovery from a depressive episode. But what do you see in long-term, like 1-year outcomes, 2-year outcomes, and 3-year outcomes for medicated patients? Well, honestly, with real-world patients, you see 1-year remission rates, meaning they're not depressed, anywhere from like 10 to 15%. Whereas in the unmedicated, we're seeing like 85% people at the end of 1 year aren't depressed. Now, there's some studies where it's a little closer. There was one World Health Organization study where the people who got treated, 50% were depressed at the end of 1 year versus 25% of those who didn't take an antidepressant. But the differences in 1 year, well rates, remission rates are dramatic for depression. And you see it with other disorders as well. Even with psychotic disorders over the long term, it's always the unmedicated group that has higher recovery rates. So yeah, this is the big problem. And you've got the risk that you're going to become more chronically, symptomatic. You have the risk too, you're going to move to a more serious disorder. So you'll see that there's an increased risk if you take an antidepressant that you'll become bipolar. And there's an increased risk that the impairments associated with it will lead you, onto disability.
So very quickly, Robert, can you define bipolar for us?
Of course not. No, I'm laughing, but listen, what you used to have was something called manic depressive illness. And it meant you had a time of mania that was so severe that you were hospitalized for it. And you had a time of depression so severe you were hospitalized for it. And listen, it was a very rare disorder. You'd see different prevalence studies, but it might affect 1 in 1,000 adults in a year, 1 in 3,000 adults. It was a rare disorder. It was also seen as episodic, that either the depression or mania would clear up over time. So what happened was, ever since 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association published the 3rd edition of its diagnostic manual, it began expanding the boundaries of different disorders, making it easier to diagnose. And now you can get a diagnosis of bipolar if you just have like a couple days of hypomania, which means, I don't know, you're a little bit happier than normal. And, you don't have to be hospitalized for depression either. So basically, bipolar suddenly was being applied to people who, had mood swings as opposed to having been hospitalized for, these two poles. And now if you see what is driving our disability numbers in the U.S. and elsewhere, it is the affective disorders. So our number of people on disability due to mental illness has risen from about 1.25 million adults in 1987, which is when Prozac came to market, to more than 5 million today. And it's really being driven by mood disorders, with bipolar a major cause of that increase. So what is bipolar? There used to be an old sort of organic thing that happened to, rarely to people. And now it just means mood swings.
Now, I want to talk now about some of these side effects, because I have to be honest, as a consumer in this culture, I'm only told about how these drugs can really help. And of course, we're marketed to, and you got those beautiful pharma ads with people walking through fields with sunlight and all that. But I'm looking here, Robert, now at a study in PLOS Medicine, which reports that young adults between the ages of 15 and 24 were nearly 50% more likely to be convicted of a homicide, assault, robbery, arson, kidnapping, sexual assault, or other violent crime when taking an antidepressant than when they weren't taking a psychiatric drug. First, is this correlation or causation? Because that's a pretty shocking statistic.
So what the research shows on this is that, if you take you take some risk that a person's going to that a depressed person's going to commit a violent act, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what the data shows is that you're going to increase the risk that will happen if you're on an antidepressant. So that's the first thing. So in any individual one case, you can't say, the cause is that person was on an antidepressant.
Mm-hmm.
All we can know is that the risk of it for that individual was, the risk in generally is increased by 50%, that you'll have a homicidal or suicidal or aggressive act. Now, here's the thing is that there is also data that shows that this can happen in people who were never aggressive before or who never had a homicidal thought before. And one of the there seems to be with antidepressants a couple mechanisms that could be to blame. One is these drugs can stir something known as akathisia. Akathisia is an incredible inner agitation. People will pace. They can't sit down. They want to get out of their skin. And that is known to be associated with increased risk of violence and suicide both, and aggressive behavior. And by the way, some of the people you can interview who've done a horrible act like there's a man I was spending some time with recently named David Carmichael. He was just a person who was a working father, pretty successful guy, and he goes on an antidepressant, and eventually he murders his son. And if you talk to him today, he's like, I never had a homicidal impulse, and his thinking just went completely crazy. Anyway, the point is, it increases the risk, and it can stir such feelings, thoughts that were never stirred before in that person. So it's causative in the sense that it definitely increases. If you pour antidepressants into a society, you can expect, the way we do, you can expect some increase in violence and homicide. In the same way you can with alcohol, right? I mean, we know if drinking is associated with increased aggression and that sort of thing.
Well, indeed. So, I'm interested in why is this really never part of the mainstream narrative when discussing things like school shootings? Are parents really made aware of the risks when they put their children on these drugs? In fact, are the doctors prescribing them or psychiatrists prescribing them actually even aware of these risks?
The answer is no. So the question is why isn't this part of the discussion, and why can't we at least have a national inquiry into it? Because we've had all these school shootings. As you said in the beginning, if you actually look into the history of the people involved in this, the shooters, so many of them are either on drugs or have just come off drugs, and either one can be problematic and drug related. So why don't we have this? Well, one of the things that psychiatry, American psychiatry, in collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry, did very successfully, and this goes to this very topic, was say that people who raised this issue were, they're Scientologists, or they're flat earthers, they're non-scientific. And so go all the way back to 1992, I think that was the first hearing. There were people at MGH, including a guy named Jonathan Cole. Now, Jonathan Cole was the first head of the Psychopharmacology Service Center at the NIMH. So this is a sort of the father of American psychopharmacology. Anyway, he collaborated in a study in the early 90s where they gave Prozac to individuals, and some of them became homicidal or suicidal. And they sort of did a challenge-re-challenge thing, if I remember. So this was really a worry that Prozac could cause homicidal, suicidal, actions. By the way, it showed up in the clinical trials too as well. There was something like 50 people that had a psychotic episode, and you had this sort of aggressive behavior. So what happened then? This is a key moment. There was a hearing, and believe it or not, the FDA did not even call Jonathan Cole to testify. A hearing on this very question: can Prozac cause suicidal, aggressive behavior? And at that time, the pharmaceutical industry, in collaboration with academic psychiatrists, came up with a strategy. And they basically said, this is Scientologists raising this. And once they raised that successfully with the media, it was a way to delegitimize criticism and inquiry, because no media wants to say like, oh, we're just repeating like whatever the talk of the Scientologists is. So that's what they did. They basically put this inquiry out of bounds by associating with Scientology non-scientific questions, non-scientific thinking, and it's kept that way. Remember the Sandy Hook shooting
Sure.
in Connecticut a few years back?
Mm-hmm.
So this was while Obama was president, and under Obama you had this thing where you could put up a petition on the government's website, and if you got like 25,000 signatures, then the White House would take it up for inquiry. And so someone put up a petition, wanted an inquiry into, can we just have an investigation to see if there's some drug link between all these school shootings and use of antidepressants and other psychotropics. And for some reason, that petition was removed very quickly. And all I can say is, pharmaceutical companies, they're big lobbyists. Anyway, they have managed to squash this whole inquiry. And it's pretty rare when a newspaper will even address this possibility. And what's so frustrating, Chris, to me is the data's there. The data show these drugs can increase the risk that someone will have a suicidal, homicidal ideation. We have all these incidences. You mentioned the Plough study. There's been all sorts of reports to MedWatch. Someone did a study on the number of homicides. There were a number of homicides associated as caused by the drug, and yet we can't have a public discussion about it.
In fact, I was at the CCHR international.org website, and they have the facts here. And one fact quoting from their website says at least 36 school shootings and or school-related acts of violence have been committed by those taking or withdrawing from psychiatric drugs, resulting in 172 wounded and 80 killed. In other school shootings, information about their drug use was never made public, neither confirming or refuting if they were under the influence of prescribed drugs. So that's astonishing. I mean, if you said, we had 36 school shootings resulting in 172 wounded and 80 killed after kids had gone onto an ISIS website, we'd be pretty concerned, right?
Yeah, or even if they would, after they had taken, some illegal drug, we'd be very concerned.
Very concerned.
Saw that linked. Yeah, I sometimes don't totally understand this, how this has been kept out of the media and been kept off limits to public inquiry, because the data is there. But it's interesting. You just mentioned that's on the CCHR website. Now, I'm sure if you went down, they could point to you where they got the information for that, because that group tries to be, accurate in its website. But it is associated with Scientology. So our very problem is that where this information is being presented is on a website that to the public at large is seen as discredited and is part of a cult. So this sort of shows up the problem is that we at Mad in America have done writings about this, okay? So we do sort of explore this. But the problem is, do you see it in the New York Times? Do you see it on, mainstream magazines? And by the way, I in the past I tried to pitch a story on this to magazines, and it's just they won't do it.
And probably for the oldest reason in the world, which is they don't want to upset a major advertiser.
Oh yeah, the magazines, forget it. They're so heavily reliant on pharma ads. They're not going to upset that. Same with TV. I'm not quite sure why newspapers won't, but I really think it's because newspapers bought the larger narrative. The drugs are good. They help people. Side effects are fairly rare. And the critics really come from this Scientology, this delegitimized perspective. And that's the problem we have. And that's the narrative that has driven the public understanding and reporting on this for now 25 years at least.
Yeah, and so in that CCHR article, I actually went down and looked at where they got their data from and what the facts were, and could we source that? And it seems there's to me at least, unless this gets disproven somehow, there's pretty strong evidence that a lot of these school shooters were on or withdrawing from psychiatric drugs. And of course, get back to the PLOS study, if you say you're 50% more likely to be involved in some violent crime, and then you multiply that across millions of people taking this, of course there are going to be some episodic violent acts that happen as a consequence of the drug use. That just seems like that's just statistics.
Yeah,
right?
that is just statistics. And it just means, just as you said, you put a lot of people on these drugs and you have a 50% increase, even if the risk is small, it's going to lead to some notable increases in violent episodes. Then there's even, by the way, just so you know, there's some research coming out of New Zealand and Australia related to, you see it, about 10% of the population has a certain, I forget what the CY something or other for metabolizing these drugs that allows the serotonin to build up, and it's that group that seems to be at increased risk of a violent episode. So there may even be some biological understanding of which group of people are at risk.
Yeah. Now, I want to turn here now to this idea of really our times and the times that we're living in, because a lot of people are reporting increased levels of unhappiness, depression, things like that. And in fact, I've been reading more and more about how what is being termed depression today should more accurately be termed demoralization. And unlike depression, demoralization is resistant to treatment. I'm going to quote now from an article by John Schumacher that really caught me, and I've been sharing this around. It's entitled The Demoralized Mind, and the quote is this: "Rather than a depressive disorder, demoralization is a type of existential disorder associated with the breakdown of a person's cognitive map. It is absorbed. As it is absorbed, consumer culture imposes numerous influences that weaken personality structures, undermine coping, and lay the groundwork for eventual demoralization. Its driving features, individualism, materialism, hypercompetition, greed, overcomplication, overwork, hurriedness, and debt, all correlate negatively with psychological health and or social well-being." The quote that comes to mind here for me now, Robert, is from Krishnamurti, which is, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. In many cases, I feel like it's our culture is driving us towards states of unhealth, and the easy solution is, well, can't we just take a pill to fix that? It feels like that's what we're trying to solve for here.
Honestly, I think that's brilliant. And I think that's a really brilliant sort of description of what's happening. So if you go back to depression, by the way, people hospitalized for depression, say in the 40s or 50s and all, a real depressive episode hurts like hell.
Yeah.
You're just in pain, and it's a really severe thing. That's not what's happening to the vast majority of people being diagnosed today and taking antidepressants. And it's just as you say, I think that it's putting the finger on exactly what is the problem. So many people are demoralized. They're demoralized because life is, for all the reasons you said. Maybe they're struggling with bills, personal connections, or lack of personal connections, lack of connections to community, on and on. And then one of the things that our current paradigm of care does, it puts all the problem for a society that causes people to be demoralized on the individual. So the problem is inside the person's head, as opposed to reforming society and creating a society that is more sustaining for people. And think about how silly it is that you can fix demoralization with a pill. Mm-hmm. When the problem is the person's living in a way and in a society, in a social structure that is in fact demoralizing. And I absolutely think that's what's happening over and over again. And one of the things, so ADHD, right? So we have an increasing number of our kids getting diagnosed with ADHD, and we say, oh, the problem is the kid can't pay attention. We got to give him a stimulant in class. Well, you can find schools that, instead of blaming the kid, rearrange their school day or rearrange their school structure. And by the way, also try to rearrange diet, bring exercise into the play, that sort of thing. Their ADHD went away. So in other words, they changed the environment. And I know, for example, also, I know a psychotherapist, the way he treats his patients who are, I think, really demoralized, he requires them to volunteer 2 hours a week. He says, well, they get out, now they're helping other people, that makes them feel good about themselves, they're socializing. So this actually, I think, is the problem, why we have this huge increase in depression and anxiety, etc., is that our society, and I believe the way we eat, but the way we work, the way we communicate, the lack of socialization and all, is demoralizing. And the idea that a pill is going to fix that is just ridiculous.
Well, indeed. And so for people who are finding themselves either in a demoralized or even a depressed state, if I was going to summarize what I've taken away from the data as I see it, is that I would personally avoid taking antidepressants as a first course of action. It would be very, very far down on my list. Up on my list would include changing my patterns, making sure that I'm exercising. Exercise seems to correlate very well with good outcomes. Surprise.
Yep.
Changing my nutrition. There were a lot of things that I would consider frontline treatment. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're doing is you're flipping the concept, this concept here. Rather than think of how are you going to treat your illness or treat symptoms, you should ask yourself, how can I build a healthier life? What's a path to wellness? And you just gave it. I mean, I think obviously diet's important. Exercise, by the way, it even sort of correlates with aerobic capacity. As you increase your aerobic capacity, you see some rise in moods and out of depression. And then you want to look at, am I happy in my work? What is my social life like? And the reason for that is, what do we all need to be well? Well, we do need we need shelter, we need food, hopefully good food. We need someone to love or someone to love us. We need meaning in life. And without those, we all start becoming demoralized, right? Go lose your job. Go get divorced. You'll feel bad for a while. Or eat crap for all the time. So really the focus should be, rather than trying to take a pill to fix that symptom, which, by the way, isn't even very effective over the short term in terms of helping you increase your mood, improve your mood, is how do we stay well? And ask yourself that question. What's the path to a better, healthier life? And, yoga, whatever it might be. And there's plenty of evidence that, of course, is long-lasting improvement. And by the way, there was a study done by the NIMH, a 6-year study in the 1990s. They said, what is the natural course of untreated depression? And it was a 6-year study, and what they found was that people who did not take an antidepressant 6 years later had actually improved their lives. A lot of them had been through divorces, lost jobs, but 6 years later, now they were in a better social situation, and also they were making more money than when they first had the depressive episode. And this gave some thought to that a depressive episode can actually be a signal, sort of an evolutionary signal that you need to make change, and it may be rough for a while, but you need to make a change in the way you live in order to stop being demoralized. And even if you're in a society that sort of encourages it, maybe it takes extra effort to do so.
Well, indeed, very well said. And Robert, I want to thank you so much for your work in opening this up. This has really given me a lot of the information that I need to take forward and have conversations with people I know and love. And the data is really compelling at this point in time. And I want to thank you for your work, your dedication, your time today. But please tell people how they can follow your work and contribute to your mission.
Well, what the website that you mentioned is where we are trying to create a community for these very issues. It's called madinamerica.com. And we have bloggers from around the world. And the bloggers come from everything we have psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, family members, people with lived experience. And the one commonality is they think we need to make changes. Then we have science there that reports on the scientific research that you generally don't see in the mainstream media because it goes against the conventional narrative. And we have other resources for parents, that sort of thing. People, as you mentioned, you can also go on, I guess it's the About section. You'll see my name there, Robert Whitaker, and you can click on that and you can get access to slide presentations, source documents I've used in my books. You can also do that there's a resource section as well. So really, that's the place that today we're trying to create this community, an international community for people to rethink psychiatry and search out new solutions. And it's really interesting in that we now have affiliates in other countries. I travel quite a bit, and every single country that has adopted this paradigm of care and this belief system has seen the burden of mental illness in a society go way, way up among children, among adults. And so there really is sort of an international effort to rethink things right now. We even just had a United Nations report where the report said, we need a revolution in mental health. This old paradigm has failed. The only thing is replacing that old paradigm. That's a very profitable paradigm. It gives a lot of power to people. So it really is a big struggle.
Well, absolutely. And as it's often quipped, science does progress one funeral at a time. So, well, with that, Robert, thank you again so much for your time today. This has been absolutely fascinating, and we're going to have a great conversation about this at our website, Peak Prosperity. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It was really an enjoyable interview. Thanks so much.